Okay then. Well, I think we're probably just about ready to get started, if you agree, Jack. Anyone else
Yeah,
can join. Yeah. Is this about the number we were thinking?
off the top of my head, I think this is correct, maybe 9.
Perfect.
I didn't remember to check today actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Last I checked was yesterday morning, so I think this is right.
Super. Well, we'll get cracking. So, welcome to the History of Ideas Reading Club. Thank you to those of you rejoining us and new faces from the series of which we are now halfway through. So this is our 6th session of the concept of revolution. And as we said at the start of this series, we wanted to encompass political revolution, religious revolution, philosophical revolution, and what we'll be grappling today, scientific revolution, with the Copernican revolution. So I think we'll get started. And what I wanted to do to mark the halfway point is start off with the sort of intellectual historical discussions that underpin what Jack and I are trying to do with this series, which is to try and understand concepts. So we've done liberty, we've done heritage, and this one on revolution, we want to try and grapple with these concepts, how they fluctuate, different routes that they take. So, you know, we didn't go in with the idea of doing ideologies because we thought that's a little bit too narrativistic. If we did liberalism, conservatism, socialism, it kind of, you probably all have a certain idea of those ideologies in the modern day in your head, but a concept like liberty, heritage, and revolution is actually a much looser thing, and that's why we wanted to grapple it. So what are the different interpretations of revolution? So revolution, what is a revolution for the intellectual historian? As this session marks the halfway point in our series, it is a good moment to pause and reflect on what we mean by a revolution in intellectual history, not as a slogan for dramatic change, but as a contested analytical concept. So if we look at people like Copernicus and who we're going to look at later, Descartes, Kant, and Hegel, this kind of concept really shapes how we think about these thinkers and how they were grappling with issues in their own day. One historian, much more of a scientific bent, Thomas Kuhn, in the Structure of Scientific Revolution in 1962, defined revolutions as paradigm shifts, these dramatic moments in which knowledge transforms, in which the basic assumptions, methods, and standards of a discipline are replaced rather than refined. On this view, revolutions are discontinuous, conflict-driven, and only fully intelligible in retrospect. Alexandra Koira, especially in From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe, again in a scientific bent, treated revolutions as a metaphysical transformation, arguing that modern revolutions involve changes in how reality itself is conceived. For example, the move from a finite, hierarchical cosmos to an infinite mathematized one. By contrast, intellectual historians like Skinner and Pocock, who we've discussed before, emphasize continuity and redescription. In works like Visions of Politics and Virtue, Commerce and History, revolutions are understood as reconfigurations within inherited languages rather than clear breaks from the past. Finally, Reinhard Koselleck, in Futures Past, showed that revolution itself is a historical concept, shifting from an astronomical idea of cyclical return to a modern notion of irreversible rupture, reminding us that revolutions are not only events, but ways societies themselves can understand historical change. And again, if anyone has any questions, any discussion points, please either interject, raise your hand, or drop a comment in the chat. So revolution with the postmodern turn, what did this kind of era of 1970s, 1980s thinking have to say about this big concept that we're discussing? Well, from the late 20th century, the postmodern turn reframed revolution not as a single event or decisive rupture, but as a problematic narrative imposed after the fact. Thinkers such as Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, and Dominic Lecapre shifted attention away from linear chains of influence towards discontinuity, repetition, and reconfiguration, suggesting that what we call revolutions are better understood as contested reorganizations of discourses, meaning, and power, rather than clean, sort of very straight breaks from the past. Foucault famously argued for breaking the chain of history, rejecting the idea of smooth intellectual continuity. In the archaeology of knowledge, he treats revolutions not as progressive breakthroughs, but as epistemic, so knowledge-based ruptures, moments when the rules governing what can be said, known, and thought are reorganized completely, producing discontinuities that only later narratives of progress attempt to smooth over. So these kind of progressive historians that we've discussed before, the sort of idea of Whig history, may try and say that sort of certain ruptures in history were actually all part of a kind of smooth trajectory of history, but actually in the moment they are big ruptures from the past. Jacques Derrida resisted the idea of revolution as a clean break altogether. Across works such as his famous Of Grammatology, he emphasized iterability and différance, arguing that even the most radical revolutions remain entangled with what they seek to overturn. For Derrida, intellectual revolutions always carry traces of prior concepts, prior knowledge, and language, meaning that rupture is never absolute but structurally dependent on continuity. And as you will have heard me and Jack laughing about a few times, this is the concept of the bricoleur, the person who picks up bits and pieces from the epistemology of the precursor age. Jean Deleuze, often with Felix Guattari, would reframe revolution not as rupture or continuity, but as reconfiguration and movement. In works such as A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze treats revolutions as moments of deterritorialization, where thought escapes from the established structures, our status quo, our general understanding of the way that life operates. And in escaping from that, forms new assemblages. From this perspective, intellectual revolutions are not singular breaks in history, but ongoing processes that redirect forces, concepts, and possibilities, rather than replacing one specific system with another. Dominic Lecapra, a big name in my field in intellectual history and a big influence on the way that I like to read intellectual history, would caution against treating revolution as either a clean rupture or a purely linear development. In works such as his Rethinking Intellectual History, he argues that intellectual change should be read through the interaction of texts, contexts, and lived experience, when moments of apparent revolution often involve unresolved tensions, repetitions, and anxieties rather than total conceptual replacement. So these are the differing interpretations of revolution. I don't know whether you have any thoughts, Jack, on sort of that in terms of the kind of lay of the land when it comes to discussing revolution as a concept.
No, I think that's a great summary. I would add this is also relevant to physics. I was surprised to learn that there was a fairly influential book published by David Bohm and F. David Peat called The Wholeness and the Implicit Order, I think. And they argued against Kuhn's sort of revolutionary Kuhn's idea of revolution as sort of paradigm shift and radical break with the past, radical discontinuity. They tried to argue that there was underlying continuity. It was quite a complex argument, but they basically tried to show that if thinkers had gone a little deeper, they would have realized that the same underlying understanding of space-time was always operable. I think it's a contentious thesis, but it just I think it's worth knowing that this wasn't just an offshoot of literary criticism. It actually affected the whole of the academic enterprise.
No, very valid. And obviously the term revolution in this context that we're discussing has a dual meaning, because there's also revolutions around the sun as well. So we are dealing with multiple meanings when we talk about revolution in this context. So framing what we're going to discuss today, the Copernican revolution. Well, the Copernican revolution is conventionally dated to 1543, the year of publication of De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. Funnily enough, actually, the published work was handed to, I don't know if you'd seen this, Jack, but it was handed to Copernicus on his deathbed. So his publisher gave him the final copy of what would be published, and then he died.
Wow. Oh, that's
That's
incredible.
quite a rarity. It's either posthumous or in the lifetime, but actually in that moment as he was on his deathbed. Um, but intellectual historians emphasize that it unfolded over roughly 2 centuries, and this is what we're going to investigate, from late medieval critiques of Aristotelian cosmology in the 14th century to the Newtonian synthesis of the late 17th century. It therefore represents a prolonged reordering of knowledge rather than a single scientific breakthrough. Copernicus's intervention altered not only astronomy but the status of mathematics, observation, and authority. Prior to 1500, astronomy was formally classed as a mathematical discipline, subordinate to natural philosophy. After Copernicus, this hierarchy became unstable, raising questions about whether mathematical modes could describe physical reality itself. This revolution also carried anthropological implications. By removing the Earth from the cosmic centre, Copernicus destabilized symbolic assumptions about human centrality that had structured theology, ethics, and political hierarchy since late antiquity. Again, please do feel free to jump in, message, or intervene if you so desire, and Jack, obviously, when you so wish. But let's look at the ancient and medieval cosmological inheritance that Copernicus would inherit. From antiquity through the Middle Ages, cosmology was dominated by Aristotle and Ptolemy. Aristotle supplied the physics of a finite geocentric cosmos, while Ptolemy provided the mathematical machinery. Together, their work shaped over almost 1,500 years of cosmological teaching across Europe, Byzantium, and also the Islamic world. The Earth sat motionless at the centre of the universe, surrounded by approximately 55 crystalline spheres in later medieval models. The outermost sphere, the primum mobile, imparted motion to the heavens. This structure underwrote hierarchical thinking in theology and politics, reinforcing notions of order, rank, and final causation. And we can see from what we've looked at in terms of Greek thought, that kind of idea of this hierarchical system filtering through into these interpretations of cosmology. Intellectual historians stress that cosmology functioned as a comprehensive worldview. To challenge the Earth's centrality was therefore to unsettle assumptions about authority, stability, and the intelligibility of the natural order. So who was Ptolemy? Who was this great precursor to Copernicus? Well, Ptolemy's Almagest accounted for planetary irregularities through epicycles, deferents, eccentrics, and the equant. By the 13th century, planetary tables required dozens of epicycles to predict observed motion, particularly Mars's retrograde path, which deviated by up to 8 degrees from simple circular models. The Alphonsine tables of 1252, widely used across Europe, achieved predictive accuracy within 5 acrominutes of planetary positions. However, this accuracy came at the expense of philosophical coherence. It violated Aristotle's insistence, for example, on uniform circular motion centered around the Earth. Returning to Thomas Kuhn and other historians, they describe late medieval astronomy as a field experiencing technical success alongside this sort of conceptual strain because it was rubbing up against Aristotle's ideas, setting the conditions for the need for radical reform in this field. So what did Ptolemy say in the Almagest? From all this, we concluded that the first 2 divisions of theoretical philosophy should rather be called guesswork than knowledge. Theology because of its completely invisible and ungraspable nature, physics because of the unstable and unclear nature of the matter. Hence, there is no hope that philosophers will ever be agreed about them, and that only mathematics can provide sure and unshakable knowledge to its devotees, provided one approaches it rigorously, for its kind of proof proceeds by indisputable methods, namely arithmetic and geometry. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Jack, on what Ptolemy is saying there, but I mean, I think it sounds quite radical, I would say, for someone of his age.
Yeah, indeed. So, first 2 divisions of theoretical philosophy should be called guesswork rather than knowledge. I see. Okay, so he thinks that astronomy insofar as it's mathematical or geometrical, it comes closest to actually modeling fundamental reality.
Mm.
That's really interesting. Um, I've never studied Ptolemy, so this is very interesting. Um, is it radical for the time? Yeah,
I should. I think talking about theology, its ungraspable nature. I don't know. It seemed to me to kind of feel quite sort of not critical, but quite sort of interesting to be comparing these things.
I think it's very Platonist. I think you
Mm,
already see this
mm.
view in Plato.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, Now the you might maybe theology made less intuitive, but Plato isn't really a theologian. He's quite critical of myth.
mm, mm,
Um, and he had a in the Timaeus is a book about the order of the cosmos, and it has
mm.
theological elements to it, but it's fundamentally a work of um, what would you say? Um, sort of elaborate geometry, stroke metaphysics.
Yeah, yeah. But
Um,
he is raising the issue that we just discussed with sort of medieval cosmology, even in his day, which is that these things are unstable and unclear. We can't fit them into these kind of very strict rules that have been put forward by Aristotle. That actually, anytime we do try and engage in physics, things sit outside of the general rules. So how do we do physics more than just guesswork? Is it the same as coming at philosophy? That these things actually do differ and vary enough to leave the rules redundant.
mm, hmm So, so for instance, Aristotle has a lot of has a whole metaphysics of motion,
Mm.
and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
they yeah. So to what extent are they? I guess it's a bit difficult because to what extent are they calling that into disrepute? Because from our perspective, physics is the same thing as looking at the motion of plants and throwing stones
mm,
and how the human body moves, as it is looking at the planets.
yeah,
Did,
yeah.
did Ptolemy see a basic division here where the mathematics doesn't work for matter but does work for the spheres?
I think probably so. Yeah, I think he's very much in line in his day with the sort of Aristotelian ideas of circles and motion in that sense, but maybe is struggling to to look at sort of the more natural physics.
I guess it's
Mm,
because so I think the way I would understand it is that the fundamental Greek idea is that you have your highest representation of reality or perhaps reality itself in number and more fundamentally in geometry. There is no number without geometry. The
mm,
geometry is the pure distillation of ideal forms, and it's in mathematical reasoning that you first have an insight into eternal truths. The material world, yeah, I think the Greeks were basically unanimous in this that the material world doesn't really represent a pure distillation of geometry, but rather an impure one. But the
yeah, yeah.
spheres, basically astronomy has always beguiled people because the planets seem to move in regular
Mm,
um, cycles. You seem to be able to date them with precision. So I guess that's probably where the distinction comes from. It's probably got elements of a mythic consciousness still influencing the division between heaven and earth,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
coming
yeah.
into an epistemological and methodological distinction. They just
No,
don't have the
completely.
tools yet to deal with matter
Yeah.
on earth. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that, yeah, sort of mathematics is a stable, demonstrable, certain discipline, and that this physics, this natural philosophy, is subject to change, conjecture, discussion, and is unclear in that sense that things can be hidden from the senses. Again, all of these things that we've discussed when discussing Plato and discussing the ancient Greeks, and that they will continue to be debated endlessly because these sorts of elements are hidden from the senses, um, and somewhat dependent on, I guess, sort of incomplete knowledge, incomplete observation. So the whole cannot be known. But let's see how far Later thinkers go towards trying to make that whole known. So moving on from the ancient world, we come to the Islamic world, which was long sort of overlooked in terms of the trajectory of the ancient world into the early modern. But we see both in philosophy and in science it being reintegrated. So between the 11th and 14th centuries, Islamic astronomers such as Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, 1201 to 1274, and Ibn al-Shatir, 1304 to 1375, developed mathematical devices that eliminated the equant while preserving accuracy. Ibn al-Shatir's lunar models are mathematically identical to those later used by Copernicus. In Europe, Jean Buridan and Nicole Orseme questioned the necessity of Earth's immobility, suggesting that daily rotation could explain apparent celestial motion more economically. These ideas circulated in Parisian universities as thought experiments rather than explicit doctrines. Again, intellectual historians emphasize that Copernicus did not invent heliocentrism, ex nihilo, but drew upon centuries of mathematical innovation and philosophical doubt coming from what we were looking at there with Ptolemy through to these Islamic scholars and through the medieval period. So what about the Renaissance and humanism and, as Jack has sort of prefaced, mathematical Platonism? Renaissance humanism revived interest in Greek mathematics and Platonism, fostering confidence in number, proportion, and harmony as markers of truth. Copernicus' training exposed him to this intellectual climate, particularly during his studies in Italy between 1496 and 1503. Alexandre Koya argued that the Copernican revolution represented a metaphysical shift from a finite qualitative cosmos to a mathematically ordered universe. Simplicity and symmetry were treated as ontological virtues rather than aesthetic preferences. This philosophical commitment explains why Copernicus pursued heliocentrism despite the lack of decisive observational proof before the invention of the telescope. So who is Copernicus? Now we're coming to the core of this session. So his education, his life, and the institutions in which he operated between 1473 and 1543. In 1473, in Torun, which is in Poland, Copernicus was born, and he went off to study at a young age to the University of Krakow, where astronomy was taught using Ptolemaic tables, before continuing to Bologna, Padua, and Ferrara in Italy. He earned a doctorate in canon law, so religious legislative study, in 1503, reflecting his primary institutional identity. So the idea that he was actually very much a man of religion. He had dedicated his life to religious study. As a cathedral canon at Frombork from 1503 until his death, Copernicus enjoyed financial stability and access to ecclesiastical networks. He conducted observations with instruments accurate to roughly 10 acrominutes, sufficient for planetary modelling, but not decisive proof. His astronomical work unfolded slowly over nearly 40 years, highlighting his cumulative and cautious nature of his intellectual project. And in fact, his publisher would try and defend him after he died, and would say that a lot of his work was very reluctant. Andreas Osiander, his anonymous editor, claimed the heliocentric model was just a mathematical hypothesis, not reality, and that it was a protective. That the way that Andreas was trying to portray this was very much Andreas creating a protective lie, and possibly the most passive-aggressive preface to a book in history to say that it was a hypothesis, but actually he well knew that this was Copernicus's true belief. But we shall continue to the next slide. Hang on, there we are. So what was the work that Copernicus is most known for? De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium of 1543, the year that he died. De Revolutionibus proposed that the Earth rotates once every 24 hours and completes an annual orbit around the Sun, an annual revolution, which occupies the central position. The distance to the fixed stars was vastly expanded to explain the absence of observed stellar parallax. The work consisted of 6 books and relied on approximately 200,000 numerical calculations. The first print run is estimated at 400 to 500 copies, with surviving copies showing heavy annotation by professional astronomers. And this is, of course, at a time where publishing is only really in its fledgling stage. So to have 400, 500 copies is quite a feat, when most books would be, if you were going to ever stand a chance of reading a significant work, they were usually taken through circulating libraries around different countries. So you might have an opportunity to read it because a traveling librarian, it seems a weird concept to us now, would bring a stock of books for you to read. So the idea that there was hundreds of copies of this work being published shows its significance. Although heliocentrism reduced some epicycles, Copernicus still employed over 30 circular motions, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, the various cyclical cycles that he's put there, reflecting his commitment to classical geometrical ideals. So still in the vein of Aristotle. So what did he say in the Revolutionibus, or on the revolutions of heavenly spheres? Why, therefore, should we hesitate any longer to grant to it the movement which accords naturally with its firm, rather than put the whole world in a commotion, the world whose limits we do not and cannot know? And why not admit that the appearance of daily revolution belongs to the heavens, but the reality belongs to the earth? And things are, as when Aeneas said in Virgil, we sail out of the harbour, and the land and the cities move away. So what are we seeing there? He's citing Virgil. Jack, this is your territory.
Oh, I didn't study the Latins, I'm afraid. We sail out for the harbour and the land and the cities move away. Well, indeed. Well, but I guess the essence of this paragraph is the very famous appearance versus reality distinction. It's it's not quintessentially Enlightenment. That's it's a major theme of the Enlightenment, but it's also a major theme of Greek thought. And so we saw in the previous one, matter is the appearance in some sense, but the reality is the geometry. And we see those come closest together in astronomy. That was the Greek view. Copernicus now has the appropriate tools to realize that actually the revolutions which we attributed to the heavens in reality belong to the earth. So it's a paradigm shift, and it's for this reason that it's a complete inversion. It's for this reason that Kant, who we'll talk about next in a fortnight, Kant calls his philosophical system a Copernican revolution, because Immanuel Kant changes the emphasis from the object of knowledge to the subject who knows. Anyway,
I think, unless anyone else has any thoughts, what we can see in this passage from the text is that motion, first of all, is relative to the observer, as Jack sort of said in that kind of early Enlightenment vein. Copernicus is saying that you see what you see. Moving depends on where you stand. On the ship, the land moves. On the land, the ship moves. Likewise, from the earth, the heavens appear to rotate daily. From the sun, the earth rotates. The senses alone cannot tell you which frame of reference is correct. But he's also diffusing the "but we'd feel it" idea. So this is something, which even conspiracists today would try and say, oh, but if the earth is moving, we'd feel it, right? But by using the ship analogy, he is countering that. He's saying, well, sailors don't feel the ship's steady motion. yet motion is real all the same.
Yeah, it's interesting also that the how to put this. So one of the narratives that emerges around this particular revolution is that the world is disenchanted because the Earth is no longer the center of the universe. But one could read this, and I never really made this connection with Copernicus's revolution before, but in this verse from Virgil, we sail out from the harbour and the land and city move away. I mean, you have the subject, the person who observes the motion, as you said, is sort of the centre of the motion,
Yeah.
the centre of the appearances of motion. And there are many such centres, of course, as many people as there are, as many observers as there are. In a way, it actually also does begin to place the subject quite central.
The agency is still with the with the human.
Yeah, it's a scene that doesn't really quite get developed for another 200 years, but I didn't realize that it's basically implicit in what Copernicus is saying here.
Yeah. I think he's smuggling in a philosophical claim, subtly, which isn't just the sort of poetic decoration of it inserting this, but that motion can be real without being perceptible. Appearances can be systematically misleading, and astronomy itself must judge motion by reasoned structure, not everyday intuition. So this is sort of a combination of the sensory, are we going to look at it as an empiricist or a rationalist, or are we going to combine these things? And this is that kind of early period of an age where these two, rational and empirical, logicians and empiricists, will start to try and combine the two methods of thought that had long been sort of disparate and been at odds with one another. This is now the idea that how can we synthesize these two things? And I do think you're right, Jack. And I think that idea that he's sort of still toying with the idea of the centrality of humanity is partly his attempt to his wariness of making too bold a claim and the danger involved in making too bold a claim in this work. So I think that's very important. Let me go to the next slide.
It's a very beautiful painting as well.
Oh yeah,
do you know the painter?
Oh, I'm not sure. I can get it for you afterwards, Jack.
Oh, please do. I really like it.
I will. I know it's quite well. It looks quite sacred itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, indeed. I think it's brilliant how they've captured that. Also controversial, but
we'll find it. We'll find it.
Great.
So, epistemology and the status of scientific truth at this time. Well, the Copernican system challenged these Aristotelian hierarchies of knowledge that we've been discussing by implying that mathematics could reveal physical causes. Natural philosophers resisted this claim, arguing that astronomy still lacked access to true explanations. The dispute exposed unresolved tensions between Platonic and Aristotelian epistemologies. Copernicus offered a new model, but no explicit philosophy of science to defend it. The revolution thus unfolded as a debate over who had the authority to define truth in nature. He's also remembered for this famous coinage, Mathemata, Mathematicus Scribantur. Mathematics is written for the mathematicians. Here, Copernicus was drawing on disciplinary boundaries, signaling that his work was a technical work aimed at training astronomers, rather than a theological or philosophical intervention. This framed heliocentrism as a mathematical reordering, not a claim about doctrine. The phrase also served, as we sort of just suggested, to serve as a protective strategy against church criticism by limiting interpretive authority to specialists. Copernicus implied that objections based on scripture or natural philosophy misunderstood or talked past the epistemic status of astronomy as a science concerned with calculation and model building, not I'm not sure if you can see the bottom line. It's cut off for me.
No, I can't. I want to ask about
Please.
Copernicus challenging Aristotelian hierarchies of knowledge by implying that mathematics could reveal physical causes. So that's the idea that now all of the physical system of causes have been brought under mathematics, and that's what Aristotle lacked. Is that the idea?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
I think I don't think I've ever heard it spoken of in this way. And I think the way I would look at it, I'm thinking to Descartes' preface on the Discourse of Method, if it can come to me. But the issue is with specifically with the categories of matter and substance and accidents and matter and spirit and so forth, that these not so much mathematical categories, but the general language which we use to describe the physical world, it carries assumptions that are no longer tenable, particularly the relegating as secondary the relational elements of matter. So whereas Aristotle would tend to see motion as something intrinsic to a thing, a faculty for motion is intrinsic, but I think what Copernicus is starting to discover is that it's actually it's relational. That might be a bit more accurate. I'm not sure it's quite a dispute about mathematics, but I may be reading too much of Descartes' particular quarrel with Aristotle back into Copernicus. I'm just speaking out loud, really.
Yeah, I mean, I guess would you say he's demoting, you were saying, like, relational features?
Yeah, that was the Greek problem. I mean, scholars dispute whether Plato had it. Depends on the dialogue you read, but it is a basic Greek problem that relations aren't accounted for. And that's sort of always going to be a problem when you accept the appearance-reality distinction.
Yeah.
I would suggest. In high medieval philosophy, it's the essence-existence distinction. So there's what it is in its intrinsic essence that's unchanging versus the various manifestations of it, which have particular shapes and sizes and colors and forms and all of these things.
And I guess he is still conceding that sort of apparent motion is relational to the observer's situation.
Yes, and that's precisely. Yeah, is that the motion he's trying to calculate, or is he? Yeah, no, he's trying to go beyond that. But he uses the appearances to get there, no? That would be the method. So he uses his relational standpoint in order to derive absolute theorem of motion.
Yeah, and that the true structure is sort of only belonging to the whole, and that sort of subjective is operating within that sort of broader whole.
Okay. Yeah, I need to think more about what exactly is the difference between Copernicus's view and Aristotle's.
Yeah.
On the epistemology, I think it's something a bit more subtle, but I may not be thinking about it the right way.
Muse
Maybe
on
we
it,
can
Jack.
talk about it next time.
Muse on it, Jack, and
yeah, I will.
And you can bring it up. But we're going to turn to his influence on certain thinkers who elaborate further. So maybe this will be some elucidation.
Okay.
So Galileo and the escalation of the debate that Copernicus had set in motion. Well, Galileo's telescopic observations after 1609 revealed 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, undermining the idea that all celestial bodies revolve around the Earth. So this was an empirical proof. His observation of Venus's phases directly contradicted the Ptolemaic models. By 1616, heliocentrism was formally condemned as contrary to accepted natural philosophy. Galileo's 1633 trial symbolized the hardening of institutional boundaries around this form of knowledge, and Cardinal Bellarmine, someone I've written about, the Hammer of Heretics, was involved in said trial.
Oh,
Historians Yes, yeah, he was there.
I didn't realize. That's great.
Historians emphasize that Galileo transformed this Copernicanism that we've been discussing from a mathematical proposal into a public epistemological change. So, was this the moment of the true scientific revolution? So, Cardinal Bellarmine again involved in this censorship, the index, and the long-term reception. Well, Copernicus's work at this point, as a result of Galileo, was placed on the index of prohibited books. So it hadn't been it hadn't been for the 100 years previous, or not quite 100 years, but a century, the 16th century. It hadn't been. But as a result of Galileo's exploration, it led to De Revolutionibus being placed on the index. Specific passages asserting heliocentrism as fact were amended as well in later editions. So this was a later amendment to the work as a result of this situation. The work remained partially censored until 1758, so well into the mid-18th century, when it was removed from the index. Over 200 years after its publication, of course, this was an age when science had now, some scholars would say, overtaken. The age of science was overtaking the age of religion. I'm sure Jack would like to put up a stand against that suggestion, but that would be the bastardization of what we call the age of enlightenment, that the age of science at this point was overtaking the age of religion. And this timeline illustrates the very slow institutional assimilation of heliocentric ideas. So this is now over 200 years since Copernicus's work was published that it was finally allowed to be publicly read once again. Returning to intellectual historical discussions, there are cautions against interpreting censorship as simple hostility to science, emphasizing concerns about doctrinal coherence and also epistemic authority. So we can't say that just because something was placed on an index was because of some, vague dogmatic justification, but actually, how is knowledge being understood? It would be the same today as, ignoring, like we were talking about, conspiratorial works. Like you wouldn't cite someone's blog that was written at 2 a.m. about the world. So was the Catholic Church responding to some of these works in a way that was, considering that the Catholic Church, and I'm sure Jack will love me for saying this, but the Catholic Church was the sponsor of many scientific investigations as well. So we can't say that religion and science were working in opposition to each other, but was it sort of a regulatory system that stopped kind of fringe works taking hold and infusing a population? I don't know if you have any comments on that, Jack, in terms of any sort of religious relationships with scientists. Not yourself, but the Catholic Church.
No, I think you summarized it quite fairly. I don't think the lesson to be taken from this story is that there was this major opposition between religion and science. The church, as you say, did a lot for science. And
if you want to hear more on this topic, go to our YouTube page on the Intellectual Historian and look at that talk with Dominic Aquila, because he explains this beautifully.
Yeah. And you mentioned Copernicus was a canon. I didn't realize that, but a canon means he's a priest, not just a priest, but a priest who's selected to advise a bishop. So these two worlds were quite intertwined. I think what's all that's a dispute is the epistemology. That's my view. That essentially you're having a period where we're trying to understand what actually is the standard of scientific empirical truths, and the natural philosophy, it's always been this way, going back to the Greeks, says that somehow the empirical truth is lesser, and here comes along induction, basically able to show that certain theses are falsifiable about the natural world, through observation, systematic observation, and I guess the church was very slow to understanding what that meant, and so it's follows reading that the publisher of Copernicus' work says in the aforementioned preface that you say was the most what did you say, it was the most passive aggressive preface in history. This is a hypothesis, but that's exactly what was at dispute. Now, I mean, there are other layers to this story. I do know that I think Galileo was sort of had a bad name put in for him by the a bad word put in for him by some bishop or some cardinal who tried to persuade the Pope that this was a more serious book than it was, a more grave book than it was. And that was partly why the trial was called. But absent that, Galileo knew the Pope very well, knew two popes very well, and was friends with them. So he wasn't exactly an enemy of the church. It's an episode of history that's been quite remarkably misunderstood. But I don't think it was a perfect episode of history either, from the Catholic Church's perspective. But I don't think it was as bad as most people make out.
Well, moving forward into this period, then maybe we can explore the relationship between the fall of the age of religion and the rise of the age of science a little bit further. So what are the intellectual, anthropological and political consequences of what Copernicus had done? Well, the Copernican revolution contributed to the gradual displacement of humanity from the cosmic centre, reshaping early modern anthropology and metaphysics. By the late 17th century, Newtonian physics completed this transition with a mathematically unified universe. Politically and intellectually, Copernicus became emblematic of how new forms of knowledge destabilize inherited orders. The episode reveals the deep entanglement of cosmology, authority, and legitimacy in early modern thought. Intellectual historians treat Copernicus as a foundational figure in the emergence of modern conceptions of nature, truth, and human self-understanding. So I'm just sort of, it's funny because there's a massive criticism of the Enlightenment for being so human-centric, for being so what we would now call in modern lingo and anthropocentric. And the idea of the Anthropocene and the Enlightenment as a symptom of an obsession with anthropocentric readings of politics, science, all of these things, the way we engage with the natural world. So to say that the Enlightenment somehow decentralized humanity, I think is quite funny. But obviously, for a broader understanding of these scientists during the Age of Enlightenment, science really was trying to break away from the church in that sense and position humanity as just as a part in a broader mechanism. But did the Enlightenment actually decenter humanity? That's something really that can be discussed at length, and I'd probably argue it didn't. I don't know about you, Jack.
No, I mean, I think we're probably in agreement on that.
So as we come to this discussion of whether the Copernican moment was indeed a revolution, let's look at some of those scholars we started with. From a Kuhnian perspective, Copernicus can plausibly be called a revolutionary insofar as heliocentrism eventually displaced the geocentric paradigm and redefined what counted as an acceptable astronomical explanation. Yet this revolution was delayed, incomplete, and resisted, unfolding over more than a century rather than erupting in 1543 with that work's publication. From a Copernican viewpoint, Copernicus appears more decisively revolutionary at the level of metaphysics, not observation. His importance lies less in empirical proof than in initiating a shift from a finite hierarchical cosmos to one organized by mathematical order, even if the full implications of this shift were only fully realized later. Read through someone like Le Capra, Copernicus looks less like a clean rupture and more like a figure suspended between traditions, those medieval ones that we've discussed and more contemporary ones. De Revolutionibus reworks inherited mathematical tools and cosmological assumptions, revealing revolution as a site of tension, repetition, and unresolved contradiction rather than total conceptual replacement. He was working with the context and the different bits that he was able to get from the Islamic world, from the medieval world, from the ancients, and he was trying to fuse these things together to come up with a new way of thinking, but still with inherent tensions in the thought. For someone like Foucault, the approach would caution that calling Copernicus a revolution risks this sort of retrojection. Heliocentrism did not immediately reorganize the episteme of the 16th century. Instead, it became revolutionary only once later discourses, as we discussed, Galileo, Newton, and Enlightenment science, retrospectively stabilized its significance. It might not have been so if those later thinkers had not entrenched the starting gun that Copernicus had fired. From a Derridean and a Deleuzian angle, Copernicus represents neither pure rupture nor smooth continuity, but this deterritorialization of cosmological thought. His work displaced key reference points while remaining entangled with what it sought to unsettle, reminding us that intellectual revolutions are processes, not moments in themselves. So Copernicus then is revolutionary not because he instantly changed the world, but because his work made existing frameworks increasingly untenable. For the intellectual historian, the Copernican revolution is best understood as a slow reorganization of knowledge, authority, and self-understanding, a revolution whose meaning was constructed. I've lost the bottom line again. Over time, rather than declared at its birth. Yeah.
Great.
Do you have any thoughts on any of those interpretations, Jack? Any that you would ally yourself with more?
I'd have to think about it probably in connection with my musings about the relationship between Copernicus and Aristotle. Yeah, I really can't decide at present. I mean, at face value, within the confines of astronomy and how they thought of it, it seemed to be pretty big. But yeah, I mean, is the underlying epistemology really changing, or is it just broadening its scope?
Yeah. And with those unresolved tensions in the kind of Lacaperian reading, I think I would align myself probably with the Lacaperian reading the most. But I do like this kind of Foucauldian idea that like it's only retrospectively that the significance is applied to the Copernican moment. I think that is very true because of the trajectory of science that science then took. It took a long time for that to happen. It did not happen within the century of Copernicus's writing. So the idea that there was this revolution in thinking clearly isn't influential enough to call the Copernican moment a revolution in his day, but it is part of an ongoing revolution in science, I guess you might say.
And where would you say that's coming from, and where would you say it's tending towards?
I would say that in terms of the transformation of thought.
Yeah. So what exactly are the 2 points in Lacaperi's reading that Copernicus is suspended between?
I guess between the ancient Greek thinking of this kind of very cyclical, Aristotelian way of thinking, in tension with the observation that the Islamic scholars that we discussed were making of the world, that he is then picking up on and is heavily influenced by. I think he's sitting between those two traditional and developing schools of thought, and he's trying to fuse those together. He can't get to the position that someone like Galileo can get to because he can't make his own observations. He can still basically only operate within an old paradigm, if you want to use Kuhn's language. He's still operating within an old paradigm, but trying to project that there is a paradigm he thinks is out there that thinking will move towards, which is only realized with someone like Galileo.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair.
But from moving Earths to moving minds, I always do it, Jack. I always do it beautifully. On the 9th of March. Having knocked the Earth out of the centre of the universe, Copernicus left early modern thinkers with an awkward follow-up question. If the cosmos no longer revolves around us, what exactly can we be certain of? The next revolution therefore shifts inward, from celestial mechanics to the foundations of knowledge, reason, and selfhood. Over the next 2 centuries, philosophers attempt to rebuild certainty on new ground. Descartes doubts the world to save knowledge. Kant redraws the limits of reason to rescue science and morality. And Hegel declares that history itself has a rational structure. If Copernicus displaced the Earth, these thinkers reorganized the mind. So next time, the telescope is put away and the thinking cap is firmly put on. On Monday, the 9th of March, the revolution of modernity, Descartes, Kant, and Hegel, back in person. No planets will be harmed, but your intuitions about reason, freedom, and history almost certainly will be. And that'll be a session led by you, Jack, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I'm very much looking forward to leading that one. These are thinkers I'm quite passionate about, in all of their flaws.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to it very much.
They're quite revolutionary. They pick up the mess of the epistemological crisis of early modernity, and they develop it, and they try and correct it, and all kinds of things.
To the extent that they
dissolve
can.
it as well. So there's a lot to say, but it was a really great session, Sam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack.
Do we have any questions?
Yes. Do we have any questions from anyone?
I obviously have my my musing that I'm going to try and figure out. Because I'm just not convinced by the use of the word Aristotelian here. But that's possibly because I've not read enough about astronomy, which is true.
Well, you can read up on it before we record the podcast version of this episode.
Yes.
I don't know if Dara, no comments or anything.
No, nothing from me.
Super. Well, I think if everyone's happy, if everyone's enjoyed a little bit of science and intellectual thought, then I think we can conclude the session, and thank you very much for joining. And the next one shall be on the 9th of March in person, which we shall very much look forward to seeing you there. But thank you for listening, and we hope you have a lovely rest of your evening, and we shall see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, Oslem. Thank you very much for joining. And we did have someone else in the chat, but I think they left maybe a few minutes ago, but that's perfectly fine. So we shall bid you good night, and we shall see you in 2 weeks' time.
Good.
Perfect. Thank you, Jack. Thank you all.